Okay, folks, hope everybody's doing well today. Hope you had a good weekend. I know there are probably some new additions to class that have added during the last week. Here, if you are a new student, a couple of things you need to do to get caught up on. Let me share my screen real quick to show you where this stuff is located on Moodle. If you go to the introduction section of the Moodle page, it's set up like the syllabus with all the syllabus information just on that first page. There is a PDF file of the complete syllabus right here that you can download to your devices. And then the rest of the page is just set up like with syllabus information, just with the schedule up top. So it's a little bit more accessible. Here's I put the first chapter of the textbook, which today's reading came from, here for you as a PDF as well. You need to get a copy of the textbook as soon as possible. Make sure you do read over the syllabus and let me know if you have any questions. There is also a study tips section on Moodle that you should take a look at. The things in that section that are the most relevant to this class are on note taking and probably philosophical writing, the 4-sentence paper stuff, which we'll come around to at the end of this chapter. So I would take a look at that stuff as well. And then there is a syllabus quiz at the bottom of this page that everyone has to complete and make 100 on. You get unlimited chances to make 100. The deadline for completing that quiz is 11:59 on Friday evening. Normally, I won't set stuff as a deadline that late because I don't want people pushing things off to the last minute. But because it's drop ads and there's still some disarray running around, I made that particular thing due then. Does anybody have any questions about that sort of stuff? New folks, if you're registered with ODS, please send me your information as soon as possible. You can email it to me. Be sure and include your course and section number when you do email it to me. This is Philosophy 1000, Section 4. Does anybody have any questions along the administrative front before we recap and then add a little bit to what we covered last class? Anybody have any new students have questions, or anybody have questions over syllabus quiz or any kind of stuff like that? If you're good, give me a thumbs up. All right. So it looks like most people are good then. Let's recap a little bit of what we did on Friday and then add to it a little bit. And then I really want to kind of jump ahead and start getting you ready for what we'll be doing the rest of this week, which is kind of a lot of information. And it's kind of a lot of technical information having to do with arguments. So we'll kind of dip our toe into that and start getting used to that kind of vocabulary and language there. So let me pull up what my presentation from last time on what is philosophy. These notes are on Moodle for you as well. And let's see, let me share this. So if you remember last time, we ended with this fairly technical definition of philosophy. I went from the kind of lexical dictionary definition of philosophy, some ancient philosopher notions of philosophy as a way of life from Socrates and Confucius that we talked about last time. We talked about Blackburn's idea of philosophy as conceptual engineering a little bit. And then we ended with this more technical definition of philosophy from our main textbook, from Klosowski. So this just comes from the first page there, the reading that you did for today. And last time we went over the basic elements of this definition. Again, it's not perfect. Lots of other philosophers might want to pick at it, but this will be our working definition for the semester, our working technical definition of philosophy. So again, the intellectual activity of attempting to discern and remove contradictions among non-empirical reasoned beliefs that have universal importance, with the resulting benefit of achieving a greater understanding of the world and our place within it. And then we kind of went through and talked about each element of that definition. Does anybody have questions about that definition or any of the parts of it that we went over from last class, now that you've had a little bit of time to think about it? Anybody have questions about that definition? Okay. So then we went over some basic subfields of philosophy, many of which you read again about for today, right? And then the textbook introduced some common ideas that are not certainly foreign to us, but maybe put more of a little bit of a technical spin on them. And so that's one of the things we'll come back today as well. So when we move through the semester, we're starting with some basic logic, what we'll start on today, and then we'll look at an epistemological problem, how to know whether we're in a dream or in a real philosophy class, some metaphysical issues about the nature of reality. Excuse me one second, I gotta blow my nose. Pardon me. Some metaphysical issues, free will, nature of mind-body relationship, and then some questions about values at the end of the semester. And there are, philosophers are concerned with these debates over these issues, these non-empirical beliefs regarding these sorts of claims. One debate, so to give you an idea of the kind of philosophical debates that often pop up in these different subfields of philosophy, we can think of a kind of prominent kind of debate or a type of debate that arises in these various subfields. And this is, we can call this the realism versus the anti-realism debate. If you want to think of it less technically, you can think of it as we're worried about whether beauty, morality, the mind, God's existence, free will, if these things are objective and real and universal, or if they are inventions, fictions, made up discoveries rather than, inventions rather than discoveries. If they're just things that are contingent or have been, or just subjective to, or relative to individuals or groups of people, right? So there's a basic metaphysical debate right there, the realism versus anti-realism debate. This pops up in the philosophy of science, whether scientific theories really map reality or not, or whether they're whether all of our beliefs are theory laden or not. And so we'll see this debate pop up quite a bit over the course of the semester. To kind of get you ready for a little bit of that, let's take a look at a couple of, or a list of some basic vocabulary that you will see popping up a lot in the class. So first, I've already talked about real and anti-real. So is it mind independent or is it dependent upon being believed, right? So one key word that's introduced here is belief, right? Just on page, what is it? I think it's page 2, maybe. No, it's not page 2, it's page 7, right? Belief. Oftentimes in everyday language, we use that word to express confidence in something or hopefulness, but philosophers are concerned with belief as the mental acceptance of a proposition as true. And typically what philosophers mean when they talk about truth is objective truth. So when we talk about lying being wrong, God's existence, on the face of it, these look like they are claims that are declarative, they're propositions, they are proposing that something is the case. They make truth claims about the world. It's like that's built into the nature of our language in many respects, right? So belief will be important for us. And when we talk about belief, it's important that we recognize when philosophers are doing this and when we're studying philosophy, that they're not just talking about having a psychological state or not. They're talking about that psychological state being descriptive or pointing to something that is objectively true. So propositions, propose things, right? Another term that we'll see popping up a lot is skepticism, which might mean doubt in a weak sense, or denial in a strong sense. So doubt, I might have doubts about whether I was abducted by aliens last night or something like that. Or if you told me that you were abducted by aliens, I might express doubt about that until you gave me some evidence. If you couldn't provide any evidence, I might move to the claim that, well, I'm denying that you were really, the claim that you were really abducted by aliens last night. So doubt versus the denial of any such knowledge. So often this is used in an epistemological way. So when we talk about skepticism, we're claiming that we either don't know, so we have doubt, or that it's impossible to know. That's the denial part. That's when skepticism gets really philosophically interesting, because someone might claim that there's no such thing as genuine moral knowledge. There's just moral opinions or something like that. Or when it comes to religious knowledge or certain kinds of theoretical scientific knowledge, we might exercise skepticism in the strong sense. Skepticism in the weak sense is just a central part of critical thinking. You don't accept a claim until someone gives you some evidence for it, right? So nothing particularly crazy about that part of it, but in the strong sense, that's where we get some philosophical issues. Then we'll see people talking about universal versus relative, right? Really particular, I should put particular here. So when we talk about universals, we're talking about some property or some characteristic that applies to all members of a class, right? Philosophers are try to be very careful, especially when they're producing their arguments, very concerned to avoid overstating claims when they just mean most. They don't use all, that kind of thing. So some particular, right? So if I'm talking about some bald men wearing glasses, then I'm saying that at least one of the members of the class of bald men wear glasses, as opposed to saying all bald men wear glasses. So some versus some are, some are not, versus all or none. Right? Then necessary versus contingent. Things that are necessary in the basic sense of the term have to be the way they are and couldn't be otherwise. Things that are contingent are the way they are, but could be otherwise. So for example, the fact that I am currently wearing glasses and bald is a contingent fact about me. Earlier in my life, neither of those things were true of me. They're true today, but they could have been otherwise. And in fact, they were otherwise at one point in time. We've already seen non-empirical versus empirical, right? So conceptual and abstract versus scientific and based on observation and data and measurement of the natural world. Important part of our important distinction in our key definition of philosophy. So that will be important as well. And let's see here. Let me get to our kind of, well, we could start, so we did empirical, universal, particular, objective versus subjective. Things that when philosophers talk about objective or objectivity, they're talking again about mind independence and things that are true of reality independent of how people altogether or individually feel about those things, right? As opposed to something that's subjective, which is merely based on how I feel or a group of people feel about a particular thing. So we could ask about aesthetics, whether beauty is all in the eye of the beholder, like the subjectivist might say, or if there are universal features of beauty like Plato might want to say. Again, pops up in a lot of areas of philosophy. Is religious faith pointing to something real? Is it expressing a hope? Is it propositional or not? All sorts of questions arise there. Another term we'll see closely associated with that issue is relative or relativism. The idea that things are dependent upon groups or individuals of people, right? And then lastly, another common argument you'll see popping up, or a common idea you'll see popping up in philosophy is this idea of an argument. Before I get to argument, which is where I want to talk a little bit about in more detail today, does anybody have any questions about that basic, list of vocabulary? So here I'm just listing up basically not any particularly technical definitions of these terms, just the basic ones. So that's just where you need to start there. Anybody have questions about those concepts? Argument is fine if you do. We're about to get more into argument. Everybody good? I'm looking for hands. I don't see any. And real quick, let me check Slack. No questions in Slack. You can also message me in the class channel on Slack if you have a question. I've got it pulled up today. All right, well, it looks like everybody's good so far. So let me switch presentations then. So in your next reading, they gave you the definition of argument, the basic definition of argument here in class, but we're going to start kind of delving into different types of arguments and how to evaluate arguments over the next week or so. So we'll start with that today, but you'll really, in terms of the reading, you'll get more into this material on Wednesday, but I'm going to preview it for you today. So, or at least get a little bit of a preview of it today. Let's see, where's my share? Okay. And here we go. So basic logic. Well, today we're going to worry about just this concept of an argument and how philosophers talk about arguments, which may be different than I suspect for many of you, when your default idea of an argument is probably something like a debate between two people. All right. So what do we mean by an argument? Here's a little clip from Monty Python.
I'd like to have an argument, please.
Certainly. Have you been here before?
No, this is my first time.
I see. Do you want to have the full argument, or were you thinking of taking a course?
Well, what would be the cost?
Well, yes, it's £1 for a 5-minute argument, but only £8 for a course of 10.
Well, I think it's probably best if I start with the one and see how it goes from there, okay?
Fine. I'll see who's free at the moment. Mr. Dubake is free, but he's a little bit conciliatory. Yes, sir. Try Mr. Barnard, room 12.
Thank you. Hi. Is this the right one for an argument?
I've told you once.
No, you haven't.
Yes, I have.
When? Just now.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
I'm telling you, I did.
You did not.
Oh, sorry, is it a 5-minute argument or the full half hour?
Oh, just the 5-minute one.
Fine.
Hey, guys, switch over to
Thank you.
Watson. Right? So,
I did.
You most certainly did
Now,
not.
let's get one thing quite clear. I most definitely told you.
fucking
Not.
Yes, I did.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
Wednesday,
No, this is an argument.
just work all day.
Isn't it just contradiction?
No, it is.
Yes, it is. It is. You just contradicted me. it.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you did.
No.
I thought I was
You
in
did,
the
just Oh, look, this is
I
Okay, have a good argument.
Yeah, you literally have an argument.
Tonight, blah, blah, blah.
No, you can't. An argument is a collective series of statements to establish a definite proposition.
And,
Yes, it is. It isn't just contradiction.
If I argue,
Cody.
that becomes a position.
Cody, your
It isn't
mic
just
is
saying, No,
on.
it isn't.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't.
there, and he's like,
Process.
keep going.
Automatic gain saying of anything the other person says.
Talking to me, I was
Yes,
like,
it is.
"You realize right now, like, you ain't gonna take up more." He's like, "Yeah, you good, go ahead." And I left. Well, the next day I showed up to get my mom. Plans it fall through on going camping.
That was never 5 minutes.
Give me, like, Jimmy, this man trying to play me.
Alright,
He
I'm
said
not.
he had me take his shit.
What?
Yes, he was
You
out of
want me to go on
town.
arguing? I'll have to
What
pay for
you
another
doing
night.
here? Blah blah blah.
That was never 5 minutes just now.
Funny as shit.
This is ridiculous.
I'm very sorry, but I told you I'm not allowed to argue unless you pay.
Oh, all right.
I'm not a squad.
There you are. Well,
Well, what?
never 5 minutes just
I
now.
told you I'm not allowed to
I was
argue.
gonna do big.
Hey, you didn't.
I did.
I'm very sorry.
If I didn't pay, why are you arguing? Gotcha.
What exactly do you do in the Zoom call?
If you're arguing, I'll have to pay.
Actually, only gonna be for the first 2 weeks.
Yeah, my spare time.
They're actually doing
Yo, Cody Q
I've had enough of this.
Boudreaux, your mic is unmuted, bro. Like, what the fuck?
She said she's dead. Oh,
It's dead or it's dying. But I
If you
got
hold the button for a few seconds too long, it blinks.
That's what I
not dead.
figured.
I just broke it.
It's just broken. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it times out after 2 seconds. It's a which I love.
Cody,
Where'd he go?
What's happening? Where did he go?
Cody. Turn your mic off, please.
Where's your name?
My name's Cody.
Can't figure this thing out. I'm trying to turn it off.
If I knew how to work through, I would.
Cody, can you please turn your mic off?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure it out. It's not letting me pull up anything for class.
Just click the mute button in your name panel.
It's pulled up right now.
All right, folks, did y'all get the key? There were 2 key ideas in that little clip there. The definition of an argument and the definition of a contradiction. What were those 2 definitions? And it's particularly argument, and how is argument perhaps maybe defined a little bit differently than we might hear it being used in everyday language. Maverick, are you raising your hand to answer there? Or clapping for silence?
No, sir. I was raising my hand.
Raising your hand, yeah.
I thought one key difference was the fact that they were like setting up that argument, like about like almost as like a event, almost not something just spur of the moment, like most arguments today.
Yeah, it's not a reactionary, like spontaneous thing.
Yeah, no, they want to get into an argument.
Yeah, they wanted to have a debate, but how did they define argument?
Sorry, sir. I might miss that part.
Did you missed that one? Can somebody help Maverick out? Did somebody catch that? You might not have heard it. And let me share my screen again here to get the thing up. So as Maverick pointed out, it's not like just a random event, a chance event, right? They're wanting to have one. But they defined an argument not simply as contradicting another person's belief, which also might be a way in which we typically think of an argument, but as a group. And some of the people in Monty Python were philosophy majors, and you can see the nerd coming out here in their comedy sketch. It's a group of statements, and this is a technical definition of philosophy that we see in a technical definition of argument that we see in philosophy and in logic, and that we saw here in this piece of pop culture skit. A group of propositions such that the truth of at least one of them, the premise, is said or alleged to support the truth of the other, the conclusion. All right, so first, argument in this sense of the term is not simply a debate between two people or simply a disagreement between two people. It's a group of propositions that try to prove something. And so we've already got a couple of parts here. An argument has to have at least one premise. It'll usually have more, but it has to have at least one. The premises express the reasons for, or the justification for the conclusion. So sometimes the premise or premises may express empirical evidence. Sometimes they might be based on a logical principle, like the law of non-contradiction. And then the premises are propositions or statements that express reasons, right? And then the conclusion is the proposition that expresses the point that the arguer is attempting to prove, or that the argument is attempting to prove. All right, and so philosophers will typically, not always, but many philosophers in writing, and you'll see this in like the writing a short philosophy paper video that's in the study tips section. See him working out a paper in which they're just stacking the argument and then explaining the argument below. So it's like setting up the little skeleton of the argument and then explaining all the concepts below it in a way that's where it's like the premises are listed first and the conclusion on the bottom. Sometimes we'll call that proper form or a stacked argument. Your textbook talks about it in terms of a stacked argument. Right? So arguments are made up of declarative statements, right, that have a truth value that's either true or false. We might not know whether it's true or false, but the starting idea here is that all propositions are either true or false, right? So a group of propositions, right? So that means there are all sorts of expressions that are non-arguments for us, but that could be added with other ideas or other propositions become arguments. So the mere, as we just saw in the video, the mere conflict or contradiction between beliefs doesn't constitute an argument in this strict sense of the term. Neither does a mere belief or statement of opinion. So if I'm just reporting to you how I believe or what I think or what psychological states I have, that could be part of an argument, but on its own, not an argument. Reports, if I'm explaining to you what the weather is like outside, I'm not making an argument. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm describing something to you. Loosely associated statements like in directions or something like that. A warning, slippery when wet, right? That's not an argument. It's a warning. A single conditional statement or a hypothetical statement. If-then statements. Single if-then statements are not arguments, although they are often part of arguments. In fact, we'll see that some of our basic argument forms have conditional statements in them. And then expository passages, explanations, and illustrations, as you'll notice here, I put an asterisk by them because sometimes those sorts of passages do contain arguments. Explanations, there's something that we'll learn about called an argument to the best explanation or argument by the explanation, in which case if an explanation does a better job of explaining a fact than the alternatives, then we might think it's true. You'd have an argument there. Or an illustration can sometimes be an argument. There are these things called, or these types of arguments called arguments by example, in which you might have a an illustration that could function as an argument as well. If it's because the language is ambiguous, sometimes we have to wonder whether they're offering an argument or not. And if they are, this is what it would have to be, or these are the possibilities for what it would be, and go from there. All right. So you want, one of the first things we're going to worry about is distinguishing, arguments from non-arguments in that way. How's everybody doing so far? Any questions? It's kind of a little bit right there. So let me ask if everybody's good so far. Good. All right. So let's keep going then. So then we'll be mostly working with basic deductive logic in this class, but we are going to look at some inductive versions. Sometimes for the sake of pedagogy, in other words, for teaching and instruction, your textbook author kind of puts things in deductive forms when they really should be probabilistic arguments, but he's doing it because it's helping you learn the argument forms, and it helps kind of clarify what the argument might be. So we'll just have to have that caveat there, but we've got two basic types of reasoning or argumentation. And again, there's our technical definition of an argument. So again, to go over those three parts, the premises express the reasons for or the evidence for a claim that you're trying to prove. The conclusion is the point or claim that you're trying to prove on the basis of the truth of those premises. And then the inference is the alleged logical connection between the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion. So that's the logical part. Really what logic is the study of good and bad forms of inference. And then there are two basic types of inferences: deductive inferences and inductive inferences. And the difference between those two basic types of reasoning or argumentation is the difference between necessity and probability. Deductive arguments are arguments in which the truth of the conclusion is said to be supported necessarily, so it could not be otherwise, by the truth of the premises. So that's a very, it's a very rigorous and demanding argument form. Inductive arguments only attempt to prove their conclusions as being more likely than not, or more probable than not, given the truth of the premises. And depending on what kind of subject matter we're dealing with, the subject matter of the arguments, it might be the case that the best we can do is have probabilistic arguments. We all know that when it comes to predicting the weather, that it is a probabilistic matter, not a matter of necessity. And so there are many areas in which the best we can do are just very high probabilities, if at all, as opposed to other forms of arguments that are deductive, right? And so given those two basic types of arguments, here's some examples of each, just a basic example of each. So here's this first one, a deductive syllogism. This is a classic example of an argument from philosophy. Aristotle developed our first formal system of logic and based on syllogisms. So that means based on claims, on the relationship between claims like all x's are wise, no x's are wise, some x's are wise, and some x's are not wise. So the different kinds of combinations you can have of those. So here's an example of that. All human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, thus Socrates is mortal. So that is a deductive argument. If the premises are true, 1 and 2, and because the form of that argument, which we'll get to later, the conclusion is necessarily true. As opposed to an argument like an inductive generalization, right? So here's a probabilistic argument over on the right-hand side. We randomly surveyed 20% of the incoming freshman class and found that most of them are big football fans. Thus, it's likely that most of the incoming freshman class are big football fans. So again, a probabilistic argument. Two basic types of reasoning. And again, most of the class will be worried about some deductive arguments, but you still need to be aware of induction as well. Any questions about that basic distinction there? These aren't the only types of these arguments, just some examples of basic deductive and inductive reasoning. So when you go over to the casino, you're not dealing with deduction, you're worried about probabilities, right? And then arguments can have three, although there are more, there are three basic types of errors that could ruin an argument, right? And make it a bad argument, logically speaking or factually speaking. So we've got three basic types of errors, and we're really going to be worried for the most part about the last two. Obviously, you can have arguments about all sorts of things. Here we had an argument about whether Socrates is immortal or not, and an argument over how many of the freshman class are likely to be big football fans. Those aren't particularly philosophical arguments, although one of them kind of is about mortality. So you could have arguments about the mating habits of wildebeests, about how many people voted in an election. Those are empirical matters, right? And if we get the empirical, if your argument contains an empirical error, I'm going to use the phrase error of fact for that kind of error, something that is proven false scientifically or empirically. So that's kind of more of a restricted notion of fact, probably, because I'm drawing a distinction here between factual errors and other sorts of logical errors like the second two, a logical contradiction or a fallacy. So a logical contradiction is when we have an argument that, well, let me put it this way, when there's an internal logical contradiction and a contradiction that's internal to an argument, then it's self-contradictory or self-refuting, self-referentially incoherent, however you want to say that. That's a type of logical error. Since contradictions can't be true, we have a reason to think that either a premise or the conclusion must be false because it violates the law of non-contradiction. We'll come back to the contradiction thing later. The first set of material that we're really going to learn about is going to be fallacies. And fallacies are errors in reasoning such that even if the premise is true, it doesn't support the truth of the conclusion, logically speaking. So that's a bit different than a factual error, because in the case of a factual error, we have a false premise, right? So arguments can fail if they have false premises. They could be false due to empirical data or a logical contradiction. They might also fail if they have a fallacy in them. Right, so three basic types of errors to worry about. Of course, the empirical stuff is not the domain of philosophers. If you have an argument over how many people voted, or the mating habits of wildebeests, or what causes tornadoes, you're going to be relying on scientific data to make that argument. Here's an argument with a factual error in it. If the moon is made of blue cheese, then I can eat the moon. The moon is made of blue cheese, thus I can eat the moon. But obviously, premise 2 here is false, because we know through astronomy and having been to the moon, unless you think that that's a conspiracy theory, that the moon is not made of blue cheese. It's made out of rock. So an error, a factual error then. So premise 2 is false in this case because of what we know through observation of the world, in this case, the universe. Then we might have an argument with a self-contradiction in it. So if there are no universal moral, i.e. prescriptive truths, that should be over here. Prescriptive truths tell us what we ought to do and express value judgments. So if there are no universal prescriptive truths, then everyone ought to be tolerant of different moral perspectives. Premise 2, there are no universal moral truths, thus everyone ought to be tolerant of different moral perspectives. But of course, line 2, and in this case, the conclusion line, line 3, those two things are contradictory, because if 3 is true, then there is one universal moral truth, namely 3 itself. So this assumption of 3 and 2 are in direct conflict with one another. So we get a self-contradiction there. And then here's an argument with the fallacy in it. Sometimes you might hear people use the phrase the Latin phrase non sequitur as a stand-in for the word fallacy. That phrase means it does not follow. And that's what a fallacy is. It means that even if the premises are true, as opposed to the last two arguments where they had a false premise in them, or a contradiction in them that made something false. The premises are true, but the conclusion doesn't actually logically follow from them. So we just saw that argument, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and here I've just replaced Socrates with me, but the conclusion is different. All human beings are mortal. Chris is a human being, thus Chris likes cheese. Well, there's nothing in about Chris or being a human being or all human beings that entails that they like cheese, right? Even implicitly. So that means that the conclusion doesn't follow from lines 1 and 2, even if 1 and 2 are true. So even if all human beings are mortal and Chris is a human being, it doesn't follow that Chris must like cheese, right? So there's an argument with a fallacy in it. Let me stop again there and ask if there are any questions over those three basic categories of errors, right? So if you didn't have all the information for an argument that had empirical claims in it, you'd have to go research that issue and find out whether the premises are actually true or not based on the relevant studies if we have them. The other two matters are going to be a matter of thinking and logic. So that's what we'll focus on the most. We're going to learn a bunch of informal fallacies, a couple of formal ones, and then we'll get some practice identifying self-contradictory claims as well. So let me just pause here and ask, anybody have questions over that information for it'll be Wednesday. You're going to actually start learning some informal fallacies. But first I want to make sure everybody has those basic categories down. Later in the semester, I might ask you if this argument, does it contain an error of fact, fallacy, or self-contradiction? And if so, what is it, right? Then you'd have to explain it. So I want to make sure and at least get those today anyway, get those basic categories of errors down. Anybody have questions about that material? All right, well, we've got about 7 minutes left. So does anybody have questions about anything we covered today or what to do for Wednesday?
When will we have debates or like arguments?
Well, I mean, we're not going to have them in class so much, although we'll have some class discussions about them, but towards the end of chapter 1, after we do the logic stuff.
Oh, okay. Sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Is that PowerPoint on Moodle?
That one I don't believe it is, or if it is, it's not the up-to-date one because I did some revising last night. But I'll put it up there. I'll put all the logic ones up because there are going to be some fallacies that I go over that you don't have out of the textbook or out of the ARP article that you're reading for Wednesday. All right, folks, well, if you're good, feel free to leave and I'll see you Wednesday, but I'll stick around for a few minutes here. And I have office hours after this.
What all has to be done for Wednesday?
See the syllabus. So it's a ARP article and I believe another little section out of the textbook.
Thank you.
I had a question about contingency.
Uh-huh.
When you described it, you said that, being bald and wearing glasses was a contingency, but because there was a point in time where you hadn't been. And I guess my question was, is there a way to describe it in a way that like reaching into the past isn't an option? So like I forget what the opposite of contingent was.
Necessity.
So is it to say it's a necessity, that means it ever has been or ever will be, I guess is my question.
It means that it is and couldn't have been otherwise. So if it is or is not, if it's necessarily is not, like square circles.
Right, but if I were to say like I don't know, I can't think of an example, but to say that something will never be that way again, even though it has been otherwise in the past, that's contingent still?
That's contingent, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so contingent just means it is the case, but it need not necessarily be the case.
Okay.
So like the
Thank you.
temperature today is a contingent fact of the world. As opposed to 2 + 2 equaling 4, or the idea that some proposition and its negation can't both be true at the same time. Those look like mathematical and logical necessities.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.